This is a picture of a pilot clearing the ice and snow off his aircraft moments before takeoff. Bystanders were shocked as they watched the aircraft accelerate down the runway in the middle of a snowstorm. The aircraft disappeared into the clouds and crashed less than a mile away. However, the shocking truth is the ice and snow are not what made the plane crash. That's why we're going to talk about what happened and the pilot mistake that got 4 generations of family killed. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins on the morning of November 29th, 2019, when 4 generations of family members boarded a plane to travel from the Idaho Falls Regional Airport in Idaho to the Chamberlain Municipal Airport in South Dakota. The group made it safely to South Dakota on Friday, and after a successful hunting trip, they reboarded the aircraft to fly home on Saturday. This was supposed to be a fun family Thanksgiving holiday trip, but instead it became their worst nightmare when the aircraft they were flying became airborne and the pilot almost immediately started receiving multiple stall warnings. The aircraft entered a steep left-hand turn and never recovered from the stall, crashing less than 30 seconds after takeoff, killing 9 of the 12 family members on board, including the pilot. The victims included Jim Hansen Sr., along with his 2 sons, Jim Hansen Jr. and Kirk Hansen, who were the co-founders of Kiani, a health and wellness company. 2 of Kirk's children, Stockton and Logan, also died in the crash, along with Jim's son, Jake, and his sons-in-law, Kyle and Tyson, and the youngest victim was Jake's son, Houston. Just like that, 9 passengers ages 5 to 81 that made up 4 generations of family were killed. Somehow, 3 other family members on the plane managed to survive this terrible tragedy, but I can't even imagine how devastating this was for them and the wives, daughters, and mothers they all left behind. The reason why I think it's so important to talk about the victims in these stories is that pilots need to understand what's at stake when you fly. I know how difficult it might be for the survivors or the friends and family of the victims to hear this story. That's why I want to be as respectful as possible, but please keep in mind that this story isn't for them. The story is being told so that we can learn what mistakes were made and try to understand why. And that way, hopefully, other pilots and passengers can avoid a tragedy like this. When it comes to the crash, Kirk was the pilot flying the plane, and we know that he had a private pilot certificate that was issued in April of 2008 with ratings for single and multi-engine aircraft as well as an instrument rating. According to the investigation, Kirk had over 2,300 hours of total flight time, with over 1,200 hours in the make and model of aircraft that he was flying when he crashed. Additionally, Kirk had over 380 hours of flight time in actual instrument conditions. Unfortunately, the NTSB didn't provide a lot of details about Kirk's flying background, and in a strange coincidence, the last entry in his logbook just so happened to be on November 29, 2018, 1 year prior to the crash. And it was on that flight that Kirk logged 2.5 hours of dual received flight instruction, and that was his most recent flight review. He never made any logbook entries after that, so the NTSB had to review the aircraft logbook and talk to other witnesses to learn more about Kirk's history. Eventually, they determined that Kirk had about 10 hours of flight time in the last 90 days and 2 hours in the last 30 days, which was most likely the flight to Chamberlain. Even though Kirk hadn't been flying a lot recently, this wasn't a factor that contributed to the crash, and that meant the next thing the investigators needed to look at was the aircraft. The aircraft Kirk was flying was a 2013 Pilatus PC-12. If you're not familiar, it's a very reliable single-engine turboprop that has a pressurized cabin, and it's known for its short takeoff and landing capability. Now, I've talked about the PC-12 and a few other tragedies on this channel, but this is the first one I've covered where the autopilot did not play a role in the crash. Thankfully, the model that Kirk was flying was equipped with a flight data recorder and a cockpit voice recorder that provided investigators with everything they needed to know to determine what went wrong on the flight. Now, I'm going to break all of that down later, and it's crazy how shocking some of it is. But before we get to that, there are a few other things that you need to know about this aircraft that played a role in this tragedy. The first issue was the number of seats. The PC-12 they were flying in only had 10 seats available for the 12 people that went on the trip. That meant Kirk made the conscious decision to overload the aircraft, and at least 2 passengers had to sit on the floor. Now, the NTSB assumed this most likely was the 2 smallest children, and let me be clear about something. This isn't like putting 7 people in a sedan for a short drive down to the neighbor's house. Even though flying is statistically much safer than driving, no one should ever get in any vehicle, especially not an aircraft, when there's not enough seats or seat belts for everyone on board. It's not worth the risk. If you want to stay safe, regardless of your profession, don't ever do anything that's dumb, dangerous, or different. And I think this was a great example of something that was all three, and unfortunately, it wasn't the only example on this flight. Ultimately, with 12 people on the plane, the investigation determined that the aircraft was about 107 pounds over the approved maximum gross weight, and the center of gravity was about 3 to 5.5 inches beyond the aft CG limit. This meant the aircraft was going to be tail heavy and it was going to be harder to control, and this was going to be a contributing factor to the crash, but it was just one of the many slices of Swiss cheese in this disaster. Now, I already told you that the aircraft stalled on takeoff, but the question is why? And one of the other things you need to know about the PC-12 that the NTSB took a close look at was the stick shaker and stick pusher system. This acts as a safety device and it's supposed to help the pilot avoid or recover from a stall. The way it works is when the aircraft detects an impending stall, the stick shaker will activate, shaking the control wheel, and if the pilot ignores the warning and doesn't apply the correct stall recovery procedures, then the stick pusher will activate to push the controls forward, which reduces the angle of attack to prevent the stall. Eventually, the investigation discovered there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft or that system that caused the plane to crash. So the question we're left with is what went wrong? And to answer that, we need to look at the pre-flight. Kirk arrived in Chamberlain with his family around 9:30 in the morning the day before the crash. This is a small airport and has very limited hangar space, and that meant Kirk had to leave the aircraft parked on the ramp overnight. The problem with this is that it's South Dakota and it's the end of November and there was a winter storm moving through the area. And in my opinion, Kirk should have known about the weather and planned ahead. They were only staying one night and flying home the next day, so he probably checked the weather before they left since they were going to be outside hunting, so he had to have known there was snow and bad weather in the forecast. Either way, they landed on Friday morning and the aircraft was left on the ramp all day and overnight, and it got covered with about 2 inches of snow and freezing drizzle. The next morning on the day of the crash, most of the family went hunting again, while Kirk and another family member went to the airport to get the plane ready. Kirk borrowed a 7-foot ladder from the lodge where they were staying, and he stopped at a local hardware store to purchase some isopropyl alcohol to use to de-ice the aircraft. Now, I can't say that I've ever personally tried this before on an airplane. I know it works as a quick solution to get ice off the windshield of your car, and I'm sure it might work great to remove some frost or a few small sections of ice from an aircraft, but it's not the best solution to de-ice an entire aircraft. The truth is that this wasn't going to be an easy job. According to the owner of the lodge, Kirk and the other family member worked for about 3 hours to remove the snow and ice that had accumulated on the aircraft. This picture was taken after they had already been working on it for almost 2 hours, so you can just imagine how bad it was when they started. The biggest problem, though, is there was no way for them to reach the control surfaces on the tail of the aircraft since they only had a 7-foot ladder. This meant they didn't bother to de-ice those surfaces. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that the aircraft was 107 pounds over its maximum gross weight, and it had an aft center of gravity. But the thing is, the NTSB didn't include the weight of the ice and snow on the aircraft in that calculation, so chances are it was even more overweight with an even further aft center of gravity because of the ice and snow on top of the tail. It's worth pointing out that the PC-12 is approved for flights into known icing conditions because the aircraft has the capability to keep ice from forming on the critical surfaces, but this doesn't mean you can take off with ice and snow covering the aircraft. This picture was taken about 10 minutes before they took off, and you can see Kirk sitting in the cockpit. And this is just crazy to me because he had over 2,300 hours and most of his flying was out of Idaho Falls. So it's not like he was a low-time pilot from Florida flying in the South Dakota winter for the first time. Kirk had probably encountered snow and icing on numerous flights, and his actions make me think that this wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. Now, I don't know that for sure, but the truth is if you take off with a little bit of ice on the aircraft one time and nothing happens, then it makes it very easy to do it again and again and again, until it becomes your new normal, and now you're no longer aware of the risk that you're taking. To make matters worse, Kirk obtained a weather briefing about 30 minutes prior to takeoff. Even though it included the current weather conditions in the forecast for the airfield, he didn't request the current AirMet. Unfortunately, if he had, then he would have learned there was an AirMet warning pilots about moderate turbulence, moderate icing, and IFR conditions due to mist, fog, and blowing snow. Additionally, there were no pilot reports within 100 miles of the accident site from about 4 hours prior to the accident time to about 4 hours after the accident. And my guess is that's probably because no one else was crazy enough to try to fly in this weather. The National Weather Service had actually issued a winter weather warning at 6 a.m. and again at noon, which was about 30 minutes prior to their takeoff time, that warned of heavy mixed precipitation with 3 to 5 inches of snow and winds gusting up to 40 miles an hour until noon on Sunday. And now that you know what happened before the flight, we need to look at the most shocking part of the story, and that's what the investigators discovered on the cockpit voice recorder before takeoff. The cockpit voice recorder started about 20 minutes before they took off, and the first thing recorded is someone asking Kirk how they were doing, and Kirk saying, "Perfect. It was a lot of work, but we got it." And when Kirk was asked how much ice there was, he said a lot, and when he was asked if it came off okay, he started to respond but was cut off by someone else talking to him. A few minutes later, Kirk tuned the radio to get the current weather that was reporting light winds with 3/4 of a mile visibility due to light snow, a 500-foot overcast ceiling, and the temperature and dew point were both 1 degree Celsius. Basically, there's no reason Kirk should be trying to fly right now, and that's why what happened in the next few minutes was probably the most shocking part of this entire story. As Kirk was getting ready to taxi, he made a radio call saying he was going to back taxi to runway 31. This meant Kirk was going to leave the ramp and pull onto the runway and then taxi down to the beginning of runway 31 and turn around for his departure. You can see in this video of them taxiing out how bad the weather is. And I'll be honest, if a bystander is getting out their phone to film your aircraft taxi out in the middle of a snowstorm, there's a good chance they're doing it for evidence purposes because of what's about to happen. The airport manager was also watching all of this unfold, and he responded on the radio, and Kirk asked if the plan worked for him. The airport manager replied, "It don't look good to me. I don't know what you guys are thinking." That was the first warning he gave to Kirk, but Kirk ignored him and asked, "Is the runway in good condition?" The manager said he can't hardly keep up. That was his second warning to Kirk, trying to let him know that the snow is falling so fast he can't plow the runway enough to keep it clear. Instead of taking a minute to reassess the weather and the risk, Kirk simply replied, "All right, I'll be okay." The airport manager would go on to warn Kirk a third time, this time being very specific, saying the runway wasn't clear. But Kirk insisted on his plan, and that's when the airfield manager said, "You guys are crazy. I got berms on this thing. I got to get the snow out of here." And he told Kirk it didn't look good to him. Once again, Kirk said they'd be fine. And at this point, you can tell from the airfield manager's response that he's essentially given up, realizing he's not going to be able to stop Kirk from doing something very dangerous. This was just absolutely shocking to me. Even if Kirk didn't think this was a dangerous situation, at least he had someone on the radio telling him that it didn't look good and that he was crazy. And the fact that he just ignored this guy and decided to take off was ridiculous. This entire flight was dumb, it was dangerous, and it was different, and unfortunately it turned out deadly. And before we find out what happened during the takeoff, I just want to point out how I think this is such an important lesson for pilots. When you're flying with friends or family, it's easy to fall into the trap of feeling the pressure to make the flight happen. Now, your passengers don't understand the dangers associated with flying, and they're not going to be the ones to tell you that what you're about to do is a bad idea. And I think that's why it's so helpful to have someone else, almost like an independent third party, to keep you in check. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you're not 100% sure about the safety of the flight, just call another pilot and ask them to review your plan. They just might be the one person that stops you from killing yourself or your family. Unfortunately, in this case, Kirk used this as an opportunity to complain to the passenger next to him, suggesting that he could have had the runway cleared in 30 minutes if he was doing it himself. Despite all the warnings and ominous signs, Kirk lined up at the end of the runway for takeoff, and there wasn't anything that could stop what was about to happen next. When it comes to the takeoff, remember that the PC-12 has a stick shaker and stick pusher system. However, one of the things I didn't talk about earlier was that when you have the propeller heat turned on and the engine inertial separator selected to open, it puts the system into something known as pusher ice mode. The reason this is a big deal is because it means the system automatically adjusts to provide warnings at a lower angle of attack and a higher airspeed. Basically, when you have the heat turned on, the system assumes there's a risk of icing on the control surfaces, so it gives you a larger buffer when approaching a stall. And Kirk needed to modify his takeoff speeds to compensate for this. When the pusher ice mode is on, you need to increase your takeoff rotation speed from 82 to 92 knots. And the reason why is because the stall speed at which the system activates increases to 87 knots. The problem was Kirk didn't account for this, and he started his rotation at 88 knots, which was 4 knots below the required speed, and that meant the stick shaker activated approximately 1 second after getting airborne. Now at that point, it might have been possible to save the aircraft, but unfortunately Kirk made one more mistake that ultimately sealed their fate because it was the last slice in the Swiss cheese model. The flight data recorder had 25 hours of history, which allowed the NTSB to figure out that Kirk's takeoff technique involved a relatively abrupt and heavy pull on the control wheel. This equated to a rotation rate of about 4.3 degrees per second and an initial pitch angle above the 9-degree flight director target, which was consistent with other flights Kirk had flown in the past. By comparison, other pilots that flew this aircraft had a rotation rate of about 3 degrees per second and an initial pitch angle of 5 degrees before gradually increasing the pitch to the 9-degree flight director target. The truth is that if Kirk's rotation rate was just a little bit slower or he didn't bring the nose up so high, the aircraft likely would have accelerated enough to make the stall warning go away and they would have been fine. Unfortunately, he kept pulling back, decreasing the airspeed, and the stick pusher activated 15 seconds after they got airborne. And essentially what was happening was the pusher would activate, the nose would drop, and the angle of attack would decrease and the shaker would stop, but then Kirk would pull back on the controls and the cycle would start all over again. Now, the aft center of gravity made things worse because it was harder to control the aircraft, and those pitch oscillations continued as the airspeed got slower and slower until it entered a deep stall and rolled to the left and crashed. I think the most tragic part of this entire story is that when the lodge owner spoke to Kirk on the morning of the flight, he told Kirk not to go and said they had room for his family to stay one more night. However, Kirk said they needed to get home and the aircraft was 98% good. This was probably one of the most powerful cases of get-home-itis that I've seen in a long time. The need to get home was so powerful that Kirk completely disregarded multiple safety concerns and ignored everyone trying to warn him that this was a bad idea. The NTSB said the probable cause was the pilot's loss of control shortly after takeoff, which resulted in a stall. However, in my opinion, the root cause of this was the plan. Looking back on it all, I felt like Kirk didn't really have a solid plan for this trip, and he never should have left Idaho Falls to begin with. It seemed like the weather caught him by surprise, and he didn't have a plan to de-ice the aircraft, and he didn't account for the possibility that they might need to stay longer to wait for the weather to clear. As terrible and devastating as this tragedy was, I hope it serves as a valuable lesson for others, and if you found it helpful, then you might learn something from one of the other PC-12 crashes that I've covered on this channel, so be sure to watch one of those videos next, and thanks so much for your support, especially to all of my YouTube channel members and everyone that supports me over on Patreon.